In 1631, at 2 in the morning, 237 people in a small Irish village called Baltimore woke up to screaming. Pirates from North Africa were kicking down their doors. They dragged men, women and children out of their beds, chained them in the streets while their homes burned. Before sunrise, every single one of them was on a ship heading to Algeria. Among them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. She had never left her village, never imagined that men from a world she didn't know existed would come for her in the middle of the night. 3 weeks later, Joan was standing on a platform in a slave market in Algiers. On display for buyers, they circled her like merchants inspecting livestock. They squeezed her arms, ran their hands down her body, examined her like she was property, because now she was. She was worth about 8 oxen, less than what a good horse would cost, and Joan wasn't an isolated case. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million Europeans were captured and sold as slaves in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Spanish, Italian, French, even people from places as far north as Iceland and Ireland. This is the story Europe decided to forget, because admitting it meant admitting that for 250 years, the Mediterranean was a slaughterhouse where Europeans were the merchandise. And what happened to the women once they reached the harems? That's what no one wants you to know. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the like button. This channel uncovers the brutal stories that history buried. To understand what happened to Joan and millions like her, you need to understand who took them. The Barbary pirates weren't random criminals. They were state-sponsored predators operating from bases in Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli and Salé. The Ottoman Empire backed them directly. Every slave sold meant tax revenue for the Sultan. This wasn't piracy, it was an industry. Their fleets would sail toward European coasts, sometimes 30 ships at once. They attacked at night or at dawn when villages were defenseless. They took everything they could carry: gold, silver, food, but their main target was always people, because a person could be sold over and over again. Think about that for a moment. To these corsairs, you weren't a human being. You were an investment, a renewable resource, something to be captured, sold, used and sold again until there was nothing left. In 1627, they reached Iceland, the northernmost point of Europe. 400 people were captured from an island most Europeans didn't even know existed. Imagine being an Icelandic farmer, waking up to men speaking Arabic breaking down your door. Men from a continent you couldn't even point to on a map. In 1544, the corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa attacked the Italian coast and captured 7,000 people in a single summer. 7,000. That's not a raid, that's a harvest. In 1554, corsairs attacked the Spanish town of Vieste and took 6,000 captives. They emptied the entire town in one night. These weren't random attacks, they were coordinated military operations with specific targets: young women and children, because they brought the highest prices in the markets. Now imagine living on the coast of Spain or Italy during this period. Every night you went to sleep wondering if tonight was the night, if you'd wake up to screaming, if by morning you'd be in chains on a ship heading to a world you couldn't imagine. For 250 years, that was reality. Entire coastal villages were abandoned. People moved inland, away from the sea, away from the reach of the corsairs. Watchtowers were built along every Mediterranean coast to spot incoming ships. Churches rang bells to warn of attacks, but warnings weren't always enough. The corsairs adapted. They learned which villages had weak defences. They bribed local criminals for information. They waited for storms that forced fishing boats to stay in harbour. Then they struck. Some Europeans, called renegades, actually converted and joined the corsairs. They knew European languages, European customs, European weaknesses. They became guides for the raids. The most famous was Simon de Dancer, a Dutch captain who switched sides and became one of the richest corsairs in Algiers. He personally captured thousands of his own countrymen and sold them in the markets. Money has no loyalty. Nationality meant nothing when gold was on the table. And there was a lot of gold on the table. Let me tell you about another woman, Maria ter Metalen, Dutch, captured in 1731 at 22 years old while travelling on a merchant ship near the coast of Spain. The pirates boarded the vessel at dawn. They showed no mercy to men over 40, useless for labour, useless for sail. Their bodies were thrown overboard. The young men were chained. All the women were chained. Then the ship turned south. Maria spent 17 days in the cargo hold of that ship, chained to 40 other women. The space was so tight they couldn't lie down. They sat hunched against each other in complete darkness. The smell was unbearable. Vomit, urine, the stench of fear itself. No light, no fresh air. Just the sound of the ship creaking and other women crying in languages she didn't understand. Some women died during the crossing. Their bodies were unchained and dragged up to the deck. Maria heard the splashes as they were thrown into the sea. She counted 7 splashes during those 17 days. 7 women who would never see land again. One woman next to her stopped eating on the 3rd day, stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th day, she was gone. Maria had to sit chained to her body for hours before the slavers noticed and removed her. When they finally reached Algiers, they pulled her up to the deck. She hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 weeks. The light was so bright it felt like needles in her eyes. The first thing she saw when her vision cleared were the white walls of Algiers gleaming in the sun. The second thing she saw was the slave market. The process was brutally efficient. Captives were taken to public baths, washed, their wounds treated just enough so they wouldn't die before the sale. Then they were sorted like cattle. Strong young men went to manual labour or the galleys, rowing ships until their bodies gave out. Most galley slaves died within 5 years, chained to their oars, unable to move, fed just enough to keep rowing. Educated men were sold as tutors or craftsmen, more valuable, better treated, but still property. Children were trained as servants. Sometimes the young ones were converted and raised in a new faith. They would grow up never knowing where they came from, never knowing their real names. Women over 35 went to domestic work, cooking, cleaning, the invisible labour of wealthy households. But young women between 15 and 30, they were the most valuable merchandise in the entire market. They were destined for harems. Before the sale came the inspection. Women were taken to an elevated platform in the centre of the market. Potential buyers walked around examining them. They squeezed their arms and legs to check for strength, pulled open their mouths to inspect their teeth, examined every inch of their skin for diseases or defects. And in many markets, especially in Algiers and Tunis, women were put on full display for inspection. Nothing hidden, nothing left to imagination. Buyers ran their hands over bodies that didn't belong to them, touched whatever they wanted to touch. A French friar named Pierre Dan worked rescuing Christian captives in Algiers in 1634. He documented what he witnessed in the markets. He wrote that Christian women were put on full display in public squares, inspected like animals. Buyers touched them everywhere to verify their health. The young women cried, but any resistance was met with immediate beatings. The slavers would strike them until they learned that resistance was useless. This wasn't hidden. It happened in broad daylight, in public squares, witnessed by thousands, completely legal, completely accepted. Now imagine being Joan Broadbrook standing on that platform, a young woman from a tiny Irish village where she knew everyone by name, where her biggest worry had been whether the harvest would be good, where she'd never been touched by any man. Now she was being examined by strangers speaking a language that sounded like noise to her. Their hands on her body, their eyes evaluating her worth. She was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed for the price of 8 oxen. She had no idea what that meant. No idea that Ahmed already owned 7 other slaves. No idea that her life as she knew it was over forever. The journey from Algiers to Istanbul took 6 weeks. Joan was kept in the cargo hold of another ship, this time with 20 other European women. Italians, Spanish, French, Greek. None of them spoke English. Communication was impossible. But fear needed no translation. They all knew what awaited them. They'd heard the stories. The women who had survived tried to explain with gestures what to expect. Their hands mimed things that words couldn't carry. When they arrived in Istanbul, they were taken directly to Ahmed's house. The other slaves immediately took Joan. They removed her European clothes and burned them. Everything she had from her old life, gone in smoke. They bathed her in perfumed water, dressed her in Ottoman clothing. She didn't recognize herself. That night, Ahmed visited her room. Joan had never been with a man. She'd never been alone with a man who wasn't family. In her village, such things happened after marriage. With someone you chose, with someone who spoke your language and knew your name. Ahmed spoke no English. He didn't need to. Years later, Joan managed to send a letter to her family in Ireland, one of the only first-hand accounts we have from a captured Irish woman. In it, she wrote that she could not describe what she suffered that first night, only that she wished for death 1,000 times. But death did not come, and every night after was the same. That was the reality of the harem. Not silk cushions and perfumed gardens, not the romantic paintings European artists created without ever seeing what they painted, not exotic luxury, captivity, forced submission, survival, and the psychological torture of knowing this was forever. There was no rescue coming, no army marching to save them, no hope of seeing home again. Just endless days turning into endless years. Some women went mad. They screamed at walls, talked to people who weren't there. The other slaves would restrain them until they exhausted themselves. The ones who couldn't be controlled were sold or simply disappeared. Others found ways to survive inside their own minds. They created routines, small rituals that gave structure to formless days. They remembered songs from home, recipes their mothers made, the sound of rain on thatched roofs, anything to hold on to who they had been. But most simply went numb. It was easier that way. The daily life of a slave depended entirely on who owned her. But patterns were universal. First, all Christian slaves were pressured constantly to convert. Conversion didn't make them free. They remained property, but it slightly improved their status within the household. Those who resisted were punished. Beatings, food deprivation, isolation in dark rooms for weeks at a time. Second, they were forced to learn the local language, Turkish or Arabic, depending on where they ended up. Those who learned quickly received slightly better treatment. Those who couldn't or wouldn't were considered stubborn, rebellious. They were punished more severely until they learned or broke. Third, and this is crucial, no European slave had legal rights. She could not testify in court, could not own property, could not refuse her owner anything, could not leave the house without permission. She was, in every legal sense, an object, a thing. Property with no more rights than a chair or a carpet. Most ended up in one of three situations: brutal domestic work, cleaning, cooking, childcare, 16-hour days with no rest, frequent punishments for minor mistakes. A burned meal could mean a beating. A broken dish could mean no food for days. These women rarely saw the outside of the house. They aged rapidly. When they could no longer work, they were sold to poorer buyers or simply abandoned in the streets. Concubinage? If the woman was young and attractive, her owner used her whenever he wanted. In wealthy households, there were multiple concubines. They competed against each other for attention and favors. If a concubine gave birth to a son, her status improved. She might even gain some small freedoms, but daughters were worth less. Too many failures, and she'd be sold or demoted to domestic work. Resale. Many slaves were bought and sold multiple times throughout their lives. Each sale was a new trauma, a new public inspection, a new owner with new demands and new cruelties to learn. Some women were sold 5, 6, even 10 times in their lives. Every sale meant starting over, learning new rules, new expectations, new ways to survive another day. But there was one destination feared above all others: the imperial harem of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. The harem wasn't a single building. It was a massive complex inside the Topkapi Palace. Over 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, kitchens, gardens. At its peak, it held between 500 and 1,000 women simultaneously. A city of women. All of them property. Most weren't European. They were Circassian and Georgian slaves from the Caucasus region, considered the most beautiful by Ottoman standards. But Europeans were present, a rare and valuable minority. To reach the imperial harem, a slave had to be extraordinarily beautiful, young, usually between 12 and 18 years old, and she had to survive a brutal selection process. The Sultan's agents roamed slave markets across the Ottoman Empire, searching for candidates. They bought the most promising ones and brought them to the palace for additional evaluation. Physical inspection that made the public markets look gentle, tests of temperament, learning ability, health, the ability to please. Most were rejected and sold to other buyers. Only a small percentage was accepted into the harem. Once inside, training began. It lasted years. New slaves learned Turkish, Ottoman etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to look at a man, how to look away. The goal was to transform them into refined companions, worthy of the Sultan. But here's the brutal truth that shatters every fantasy about the harem. Of the 500 to 1,000 women living there, only a small fraction, maybe 50 or 100, would ever see the Sultan in person. And of those, only a handful, maybe 5 to 10 in an entire generation, would actually spend the night with him. The rest lived in permanent limbo. Not free, but not serving the purpose for which they were captured. They spent years, sometimes decades, waiting for a summons that never came, growing older in gilded rooms, watching their beauty fade, knowing that with each passing year, their chances decreased. And when a sultan died, all women who hadn't given birth to his children were transferred to the old palace, a separate complex where they lived the rest of their lives in even greater isolation. They never left, never married, never had children, simply existed behind walls until death. Ottoman records mention a European slave identified only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at 15 years old. She died there in 1702 at 67. 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the Sultan, not once, never left the complex. Her only function for 5 decades was serving women of higher rank than herself. When she died, she was buried in a cemetery for palace slaves. No name on the grave, only a number. The administrative records listed her as slave number 847. Origin Franco. Status deceased. Cause advanced age 52 years. Reduced to a number and 2 words. That was the reality of the imperial harem. Not power and luxury. A gilded prison where thousands of women disappeared without leaving any trace except a number in a ledger. So why did Europe allow this to continue for 250 years? The answer is shameful. Europe was divided and weak. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants consumed every resource. The states didn't cooperate to face the Corsair threat because they were too busy fighting each other. Some European states, especially Venice and France, had profitable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to risk those relationships over some captured peasants and fishermen. And some Europeans actually profited from the system. Renegades served as corsairs and got rich. Merchants traded goods with North Africa regardless of where those goods came from. Ransoming captives became its own industry, but the ransom system was slow, bureaucratic, and favoured the wealthy. A rich merchant's daughter might be rescued within a year. A poor fisherman's wife might wait forever. Most waited forever. Maria ter Metelen was one of the lucky ones. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they owned to raise the ransom. 200 Dutch florins, a fortune for a working-class family. She was freed in 1739 and returned to Holland. But when she arrived,